Chapter 5. While Michael was being whisked away in the giant pepper pot, the other members of Class 8 were marching in perfect formation back into school. Mr. Browser walked behind them. You could have put a long piece of straight rope alongside them, and not a limb would have crossed it or looked out of place. Nobody spoke. Nobody stepped out of line, which was not usually the case with Class 8. They marched into school along the corridor and up the stairs, and entered their classroom without a word being needed from Mr. Browser. Once in the classroom, books were taken out and pencils were at the ready, so that as soon as Mr. Browser began to talk, everyone was prepared to write down his words of wisdom. A dream class, many teachers would have said. Mr. Browser later on told them about the importance of doing at least 3 hours of homework a night. To start with, 3 hours will be sufficient, he informed them. May we do more if we wish? Asked Spiky Jackson. This normally would have brought a gust of laughter from the class. The thought of Spiky doing any homework at all would have been hard enough to believe. Now nobody made any comment. Nobody smiled. I don't wish to stop anyone from doing more, said Mr. Browser. Do as much as you like, Simon. I am pleased to hear you are keen to make a good start. So am I, called out Anna. Let us continue with some maths. Since our batteries are freshly charged, as one might put it, I will explain the theory of Pythagoras to you, and for homework you can work some examples. Mr. Browser began to draw earnestly on the blackboard, and the class watched him in absolute silence. At that moment Mr. Salt entered. He had been worried about the visitor class into the field in the fog. Secretly he had watched the class leading back, and had noticed the fog had thinned out, and almost vanished as the last one entered the school. He had a sneaky suspicion the children had been wasting their time, and he decided to check up on Mr. Browser as soon as he allowed time for the class to settle down. Mr. Salt stood still when he saw the concentration with which Class 8 was watching Mr. Browser's drawing, and when he also saw the subject Mr. Browser's work, he held on to the doorknob and decided to retreat. But Mr. Browser wouldn't let him. Good morning, Mr. Salt. We were just learning about Pythagoras and his theory, he said, turning like an automaton towards the headmaster. The sum of the squares. Yes, said the headmaster hastily. I used to teach Pythagoras to my brightest pupils when I was a class teacher. But do you think this class will cope with it? I thought some of them were still rather weak at their tables. In truth, he couldn't remember much about the theory himself. We shall all have mastered this by tomorrow, announced Mr. Browser proudly. Then I shall go on to some more advanced work. Logarithms, for example. Logarithms? Repeated the headmaster, vaguely recalling this has been something that had been taught when he was at his grammar school at the age of about 13, not in a junior school at the age of 10. He changed the subject. I hope you found your expedition into the fog worthwhile, he said, addressing the class. Before anyone could reply, Mr. Browser answered for them. We achieved what we set out to do, he assured the headmaster. It was well worthwhile. And just in time too, observed Mr. Salt. The fog seems to have cleared up completely. And he looked out of the window. He caught sight of Michael's empty place near one of the windows. One missing, I see. Is there someone absent? No, I remember. Michael Farley sits there, and he was here first thing in the morning. Where is he, Mr. Browser? The headmaster believed he had hit upon something wrong in the class, and awaited an answer happily. And knowing Michael, he thought that perhaps he'd stayed outside, and Mr. Browser hadn't spotted this. Mr. Browser looked confused for a second, until Spiky Jackson started speaking. I think Michael stayed behind with the he began. The words died on his lips, and his mouth hung open as if he had jaw lock. Mr. Browser's confusion changed to anger. "I'll certainly look into it, Mr. Salt," he said. "I think he must have slipped out into the cloak-room. And now, please, we must waste no more time. We have much to do to-day. Excuse me, please, Mr. Salt. The sum of the squares—" All eyes were directed to the blackboard, and Mr. Salt's presence was at once forgotten. He stood there for a few seconds, feeling rather a nuisance, and he didn't like that. "Carry on, Mr. Browser," he said, and he left the classroom. On his way back to his room he looked into the cloakroom for Michael, but he wasn't there. "There's something odd about Class 8, he told Miss Copewell. "They're all working hard in there, doing maths, which ought to be miles beyond them. Yet they seem to be enjoying it." "You should be pleased about that," said Miss Copewell, who was always optimistic. "Perhaps it's the modern methods Browser uses." The headmaster gave her a sharp look and started studying some forms. "Well, he's lost that Michael Farley," he muttered. "I must go back and check that he's returned in a while." When he did return to class half an hour later, he saw at once that Michael's place was still vacant. The class was steadily at work copying something from the blackboard. Mr. Browser walked across to the door to meet him. "Michael's just gone out to the library, Mr. Salt," he said before the headmaster could speak. "So he's come back," said Mr. Salt. "What was he up to?" "Oh, too enthusiastic about experimenting in the fog," said Mr. Browser. "He was far away when we came in. Lost himself for a while." "Oh," said Mr. Salt. "Seems likely." "Perhaps you'd like to inspect our work," went on Mr. Browser. "We have a considerable amount of maths to cover, but I think that with the effort we shall be up to O-level standard by the end of the year." "I beg your pardon? Do you mean the old 11+ level? O-levels are for children of 15 or 16, Mr. Browser, may I remind you." "I said O-levels, Mr. Salt, and I meant it. And by the way, have we any copies of Shakespeare in the school? I would like to study Hamlet with the class next term if possible." "I thought you were reading Wind in the Willows," said Mr. Salt weakly. "That's kid stuff, Mr. Salt. Bring us some Shakespeare, Mr. Salt. Give us something to think about." Mr. Browser looked at Mr. Salt. Mr. Salt looked at Mr. Browser, as though he'd never seen him before. We'll see about it," he muttered, and made his exit quickly. "Miss Copewell," he gasped, when his secretary came in with a cup of tea. "They want to study Shakespeare. They'll be going for O-levels this summer. This summer, Linda. Think of it. It's 11 years old. And Simon Jackson, of all people." "Spiky Jackson," said Miss Copewell, who knew that Mr. Salt was under stress because he had called her Linda. "Have your tea, Mr. Salt. It's nice and hot. Perhaps you'd like me to fetch you an aspirin to take with it." "Yes, please," begged the headmaster, and gulped down a mouthful of too hot tea to try and bring himself round. I wonder what's happened to Michael Farley.